The lights of Las Vegas in 1976 weren't just bulbs, they were sentinels of an empire built on unbridled laughter. But that night, under the blinding glare of the Sands Hotel, the air, thick with cigar smoke and expensive perfume, suddenly went still. Jerry Lewis stopped breathing to the rhythm of the comedy. The conductor raised his baton for the next musical number, expecting the usual goofy face or a choreographed stumble that would send the crowd into a frenzy. But he found only a hollow void in the eyes of the man the world called the king. Time seemed to fold in on itself as sweat beaded on Jerry's temples, not from the physical strain of his stunts, but from the weight of a realization that struck the stage like a silent lightning bolt. The conflict was no longer in the script or the rehearsed jokes. It was in the abyss that had just opened between the artist's rubber mask and the fractured soul of the man behind it. The room pulsed with an uncomfortable electricity. The clinking of ice in crystal glasses echoed like hammers in an empty cathedral as Jerry Lewis fixed his gaze on a blind spot in the audience that no one else could see. The ozone smell of the hot stage lights mixed with the metallic scent of fear, creating a sensory fog so dense that front-row spectators began to lean forward, caught by a tension that didn't belong to show business. He discovered something in that exact second, a truth so raw and devastating that decades of professional protocol crumbled like a house of cards under the weight of a deafening silence. What was about to happen wasn't just a break in character, but the public demolition of a legend in search of a truth that laughter could no longer hide. Before we move on, if you want more powerful stories like this, comment your thoughts below, leave a like, and subscribe to the channel. It helps us keep bringing you intense accounts like this one. To understand the magnitude of that silence, one must dive into the controlled chaos that defined Jerry Lewis's life in the mid-70s. He was the architect of an unparalleled frenzy, the man who turned charity into a mass media spectacle through his famous telethons, where millions of dollars were tallied on glowing boards while he contorted himself into 1,000 faces to entertain America. On that specific night, the social atmosphere was one of almost religious adoration. The audience wasn't just there to watch a comedian, but to participate in a ritual of mandatory joy led by a genius who seemed inexhaustible. Yet behind the heavy velvet curtains, Jerry's emotional state was a tapestry frayed by years of painkiller addiction, chronic back pain from stage falls, and the latent loneliness that haunts those who live for the applause. Jerry's world was a bubble of glamour and extreme pressure, where dates blurred into a perpetual tour of luxury hotels and TV studios saturated with Chesterfield cigarette smoke. He carried the heritage of a golden age that was fading, feeling like the last guardian of a style of humor that demanded total surrender of body and mind, with no room for failure or vulnerability. The setting in Las Vegas was the peak of this universe, a place where time was measured by the rhythm of slot machines and shows that started at 2 in the morning for an elite that demanded perfection. Jerry Lewis wasn't just a man in that room. He was an entertainment institution, a vital gear in an industry that never slept and saw his exhaustion as merely part of the show that must go on at any cost. The concrete details of that period reveal a man operating at the limit of human capacity, balancing the prestige of being one of Hollywood's most powerful men with the fragility of a health starting to take its toll after decades of neglect. He frequently checked the gold watch on his wrist, not to verify the time, but to clock the next dose of energy he'd need to rip from his soul to satisfy a crowd hungry for his chaotic, childlike energy. The starting point of the conflict that would culminate that night was hidden in the small cracks of his routine. A sharp word to an assistant, a lingering look at old photos of his partnership with Dean Martin, and the realization that the audience's laughter was becoming a demand, not a gift. He was trapped in his own creation, a luxury prisoner on a stage lit by thousands of watts of expectation. In that 1976 setting, the social and political tension of the outside world didn't seem to penetrate the mirrored walls of the casino, but Jerry Lewis felt the change in the weather in his own bones, like a storm approaching silently. The central character's emotional state was saturated by a melancholy he labeled as exhaustion, but which was actually the awakening of a conscience questioning the purpose of his mask. Every object around him, from the chrome microphone to the impeccable silk handkerchief in his pocket, served as a reminder that he was public property, a symbol of hope for sick children and comic relief for cynical adults. The social conflict here was invisible but potent. A man struggled to reclaim his humanity in an environment that only valued his persona, setting the stage for the moment when reality would finally break the fourth wall. The moment of rupture occurred at exactly 11:40 p.m., when a stagehand, moved by an urgency that ignored the red broadcast lights, slid a folded note onto the edge of the piano where Jerry was leaning. The comedian, who was in the middle of a frantic vocal improv, caught the small paper with the agility of someone who had handled thousands of fan requests, but something in the texture of that paper or the grim expression of the one who delivered it made his heart fall out of sync with the orchestra's brass section. He unfolded the note under the merciless light of the main spotlight, and for an eternal second, the letters seemed to dance before his eyes, revealing information that didn't belong to the world of jokes. The transition was brutal. The trademark elastic smile froze, turning into a marble mask while the music continued to pulse, ignorant of the tragedy that had just been read in silence. The inciting incident wasn't just the reading of a message, but the instant collapse of the barrier separating the stage from real life, a perceptible shift that chilled the necks of the most attentive musicians. Jerry Lewis didn't put the paper away. He crushed it in the palm of his hand until his knuckles turned white, while his eyes, previously vibrant and mischievous, locked onto a specific face in the third row, someone he recognized through the fog of fame. The initial balance of the night, which promised to be just another celebration of his inexhaustible talent, was shattered by a discovery that forced him to confront his own finitude and the vanity of his empire. The audience, sensing the hesitation, began to laugh nervously, believing that prolonged silence was the preface to a new physical bit, unaware that the man before them was being dismantled from within. The clarity of that narrative turn manifested when Jerry, in a gesture that defied decades of professional training, signaled the orchestra to stop abruptly, cutting a high trumpet note mid-air. The silence that settled over the Sands Hotel was so heavy that the hum of the amplifiers sounded like a scream, marking the exact instant the character Jerry gave way to the wounded man. He didn't seek the support of the microphone immediately. Instead, he stood there under the cone of light, looking at the crumpled paper as if it were a portal to a reality he had tried to ignore throughout his successful career. It was the definitive break with the expectation of entertainment, a move that put the theme of human vulnerability on a direct collision course with the rigid structure of a Las Vegas show, changing the fate of that performance forever. In that instant, the information in the note, whether a revelation about his health, the fate of a close friend, or a tragedy involving one of the children he sponsored, became the engine of a new and dangerous narrative. The inciting incident acted like a scalpel, removing the layer of makeup and revealing the cold sweat of someone who discovered that time is the only resource money and applause cannot buy. The audience, now in a state of magnetic confusion, watched the comedy icon wither under the weight of a truth he could no longer keep backstage or disguise with a funny face. The incident was complete. The balance was broken. The character was moved by purely human motivation, and the stage, once a safe haven, had become the setting for a public and entirely unforeseen existential trial. The orchestra remained static, instruments frozen in the air like soldiers, waiting for an order that didn't come. Jerry Lewis, with the paper still crushed in his palm, took the first step toward the edge of the stage, his walk losing its rhythmic elasticity to take on a heavy, almost funeral-like cadence. At that moment, Jerry's internal thoughts screamed against the habit of decades. The instinct to save the scene with a joke fought against the nausea of a revelation that made laughter a sacrilege. He looked at the conductor, a longtime friend, and saw in the reflection of the musicians' glasses the image of a man he barely recognized. The glamour of Las Vegas suddenly felt cheap. The sequins of the costumes and the gold of the frames turned into ornaments for a luxury wake where comedy was the deceased. The viewer's mental camera now focuses on the sweat breaking out not just on his forehead, but on Jerry's upper lip, a physiological reaction to the shock he was trying to process in real time before 3,000 people. He reached for his chest, feeling the bulk of the silk handkerchief in his jacket pocket, an object that had always served to wipe away excess makeup, but now felt like a paper amulet. "I can't do this," he thought, as the audience's silence shifted from expectation to judgment. The micro cliffhanger is established when he brings the microphone to his mouth, takes a deep breath, and the first sound out is not an articulated word, but a shaky sigh that echoes through the hall. The audience leans in. The casino air conditioning seems to chill the blood of those present, and the tension hits a point of no return. Far from there, backstage, producers ran back and forth, gesturing frantically for the curtains to be closed, fearing their biggest star's nervous breakdown would ruin the million-dollar contract. Jerry heard the muffled buzz of a nearby security guard's radio, a metallic voice demanding orders, but he chose to ignore the outside world to dive into his own discovery. He remembered a private conversation, a secret kept for years that now, in the face of that note, took on a monstrous and unavoidable shape. The fragility of his position became evident. He was the master of ceremonies for a fantasy world, but reality had just crashed the stage without permission. The symbolism of the stage as a sacred pedestal was being replaced by the image of a naked man, stripped of his gimmicks, confronting his own shadow under the spotlights. I want to know your opinion on this moment. Comment what you would do in this situation. The transition to the next microscene occurs when Jerry shifts his gaze from the note and fixes it on a distant point at the back of the room, where the darkness swallows the faces. He begins to speak, not with the nasal voice of his characters, but with a husky baritone, loaded with a gravity no one there was prepared to hear. He mentions a name, a detail about one of the telethon children he had secretly visited weeks before, connecting the note to the fragility of life he tried so hard to protect with his humor. The ambiguity of his expression flickers between anger at being interrupted and deep sadness at knowing that, for that specific life, comedy had not been enough. The symbolic object of the handkerchief is finally pulled from his pocket, not to wipe away sweat, but to cover his eyes for a brief second of public introspection. The tension rises when he reveals that the discovery wasn't about a future event, but about something that had already occurred while he was making the audience laugh for the last 10 minutes. The shock runs through the rows like an electric current, and the nervous laughter from before vanishes completely, replaced by a painful empathy that unifies strangers in a common feeling. Jerry Lewis, the man who always had the quick answer, was now stumbling over his words, demonstrating a vulnerability that humanized the myth in a way that was almost unbearable to watch. He describes the hospital smell the note brought back to his memory, contrasting it with the expensive perfume of the sands, exposing the brutal dichotomy of his existence. The development here isn't about what he says, but about the courage to stay on stage while his inner world collapses. Every short sentence he utters works as a micro cliffhanger, leaving the audience suspended in the uncertainty of what comes next. Will he faint? Will he cry? Or will he walk away from it all? Jerry's personal discovery about the uselessness of certain professional masks in the face of real pain becomes the thread of this sequence, elevating the narrative from an isolated incident to an existential crisis. He touches the chrome microphone, feeling the cold metal against his hot fingers, a tactile reminder that he is still in control of the narrative, even if he has lost control of his emotions. The transitions between his childhood memories and the chaotic present of Las Vegas create a mosaic of motivations that explain why that specific moment was the breaking point. The internal pressure peaks when he realizes he can't just walk off stage. He needs to finish what the truth started. Jerry Lewis looks at the imaginary dollar board that always guided his acts of charity and realizes the numbers are empty if there is no soul behind them. He decides, against all warnings from his security team, to step down from a stage and walk toward the audience, closing the physical distance between idol and follower. The movement is slow, almost ceremonial, and every step he takes onto the plush carpet of the hall is a declaration of independence from his own ego. The camera catches the glint of tears he no longer tries to hide, turning the sweat of performance into the dew of honesty. The audience is hypnotized, not by talent, but by the raw humanity emanating from Lewis's every gesture as he prepares for the final escalation of his revelation. The narrative now expands to show the impact of this gesture on the faces of the spectators, who have stopped being consumers of jokes to become confidants of a painful secret. Jerry Lewis is now on the same level as his audience, the spotlights following him like a persistent interrogator, but he no longer flees the glare. He uses the handkerchief to wipe the face of a woman in the first row who started to cry, a gesture of affection that symbolizes his transition from comedian to healer. The development of the short scenes culminates in a moment of absolute clarity. The discovery in the note changed not just the show, but Jerry's perception of what it means to be truly successful. He is ready to take this dramatic escalation to its highest point, where comedy and tragedy finally merge into a single voice. The urgency of the situation became palpable when Jerry Lewis, ignoring the frantic signals from the broadcast director at the side of the stage, grabbed the microphone stand and dragged it with a screeching metallic sound across the wooden floor. The emotional weight of the narrative climbed step by step as he began to describe, with surgical and painful precision, the contents of that note that still trembled in his fingers. It wasn't a cold statistic or a request for donations, but a final goodbye sent by one of the children he considered part of his own spiritual family, someone who had passed away while he smiled for the cameras. The connection between the euphoria of the show and the rawness of imminent death created a sense of injustice so deep that the air in the hall seemed sucked into a vacuum of disbelief and shock. The emotional pressure continued to grow when Jerry mentioned Dean Martin's name, evoking the shadow of his most famous partnership as a symbol of the desperate search for approval and love that had driven him his whole life. He confessed, before an audience that hardly dared to breathe, that comedy had always been his hiding place against loneliness. But at that moment, the revelation of the note had torn down all the walls of his shelter. Every word was loaded with a revelation that connected the night's events to unbearable psychological pressure, where the obligation to be funny became public torture. The expectation for the culminating moment was fueled by the rising pace of his voice, which alternated between a confessional whisper and the cry of someone who can no longer carry the weight of the world on a clown's back. The dramatic escalation reached a new level of urgency as the spotlights began to flicker, reflecting technical disorder backstage as the crew tried to decide whether to cut the broadcast or let the truth bleed out live. Jerry Lewis seemed to grow under the light, not as the comedy giant everyone knew, but as a man about to perform the most radical gesture of his career in the name of integrity. The sense of revelation was almost mystical. He was exposing the guts of fame, showing that behind every laugh pulled from the audience, there was a price in tears he was no longer willing to pay alone. The audience, once passive spectators, now felt the emotional pressure of being witnesses to a personal sacrifice, where the idol disintegrated, so the human being could finally emerge. The weight of the narrative became physical pressure in the chests of those watching as Jerry described his last meeting with the child mentioned in the note, detailing the smell of antiseptic and the promise of a next show he now knew was impossible to keep. The injustice of fate, which allows laughter to continue while life fades in silence, became the central theme unifying every person in that luxury casino. The build-up of expectation for the climax was almost unbearable, with Jerry Lewis holding the microphone as if it were the only thing keeping him from collapsing to the floor, while his eyes sought a redemption that applause could never provide. The emotional tension was no longer about what had happened, but about what he would do with that truth now that it was exposed before thousands of stunned witnesses. At this point in the escalation, the atmosphere at the Sands Hotel had completely transformed. Las Vegas glamour had been replaced by temple-like solemnity, where every gesture from Jerry was read as an act of contrition. He connected the pain of recent loss to his own struggle against time and physical decay, elevating personal drama to a universal reflection on the fragility of human existence. The urgency of the narrative was fueled by the perception that Jerry Lewis was crossing a line from which there would be no return, challenging the very logic of show business in favor of a moment of brutal honesty. The sense of emotional pressure was absolute, and the audience was now fully invested in the man's pain, waiting for the final blow that would turn that night into an unforgettable historical and emotional landmark. The climax erupted not with a scream, but with the dry sound of the microphone being abandoned on the stand, while Jerry Lewis unbuttoned his jacket and removed the invisible mask he had maintained for half a century. In a symbolic gesture of devastating power, he didn't utter the expected final joke. Instead, he walked to the edge of the stage and sat down, letting his legs dangle over the abyss between the light and the darkness of the audience, leveling his stature to that of ordinary men. At that moment, the great master of physical comedy became a monument to stillness, confessing in an amplified whisper that laughter was merely the echo of his own need. The great turn occurred when he tore the note into tiny pieces, tossing them into the air like confetti for a funeral for the character he swore never to inhabit in that automatic and empty way again. The central scene reached its emotional peak when Jerry, with red eyes and a face washed by an honesty that transcended any acting, called out the name of an ordinary person in the audience, a stranger who shared the silent mourning of that night. He brought the man into the center of the light, not to use him as a setup for a joke, but to embrace him in a gesture of human solidarity that broke the artist's last barrier of protection. The silence at the Sands Hotel was replaced by a collective sob, an emotional shockwave that unified the billionaire and the waiter under the same fundamental truth. Entertainment is a gift, but human presence is the only real miracle. It was an unforgettable gesture of ego renunciation, where Jerry Lewis surrendered his crown as the king to take his place as a man who feels, bleeds, and cries in the face of the inevitable. The moral tension of the climax manifested in Jerry's decision to interrupt the national broadcast, defying contractual orders and the muffled shouts of producers who saw ad time slipping through their fingers. He looked directly into the camera lens, the same one that had made him a legend, and apologized not for stopping the show, but for having taken so long to be truthful with those who loved him only for the mask. The emotional reward was immediate and visceral. The audience didn't applaud with the euphoria of seeing a brilliant performance, but with the reverence of those who witnessed a soul being rescued from the depths of its own vanity. The great turn was not a change in the script, but the total abolition of it in favor of a moment of sacred communion between the fallen idol and his congregation of stunned followers. In the final instant of the climax, Jerry Lewis remained under the solitary spotlight, refusing to accept the triumphant exit the musicians tried to rehearse with a final improvised chord. He simply bowed his head, allowing sweat and tears to mix on the stage carpet, transforming that fictional space into a ground of undeniable reality. The most important gesture of the entire narrative was his refusal to end with a smile, choosing instead to end with the truth, leaving the stage in a silence that weighed more than any standing ovation. The climax was complete. The rubber mask was shattered, the note was destroyed, and what remained there, under the merciless light of Las Vegas, was the tragic and magnificent beauty of a human being who finally had the courage to be just himself. The lights of the Sands Hotel began to rise slowly, but the audience remained motionless, as if any movement could break the spell of humanity Jerry Lewis had cast over the room. The direct consequences of that gesture were immediate. The facade of Las Vegas, known for its artificiality and excess, was momentarily humanized by the vulnerability of its greatest icon. The frantic, childlike character the world knew gave way to a figure of melancholy dignity, permanently altering the understanding that comic genius is not a free gift, but a burden carried in silence. The environment, once saturated by the expectation of cheap entertainment, transmuted into a space of collective reflection, where Jerry's pain served as a mirror for the losses and voids of every spectator present on that historic night. In the days that followed, the entertainment industry tried to label the event as a nervous breakdown, but the public reaction proved that what occurred was actually an unprecedented spiritual and artistic awakening. Jerry Lewis never went back to being the same after that revelation. He began to lead his famous telethons with a new gravity, an empathy that no longer came from a script, but from the scar left by the note torn on stage. The resolution of that night didn't bring a happy ending in the traditional Hollywood sense, but it brought a moral clarity that redefined his career and his legacy in history. The understanding of the sadness of the clown theme became palpable, transforming Jerry from an object of laughter into a symbol of emotional resilience and brutal honesty in a world that prefers the fake glitter of sequins. The emotional closure of that night occurred when Jerry, already backstage and away from the eyes of the masses, held the silk handkerchief he had used on stage and realized it was damp with the real proof of his transformation. He no longer felt the need to fill the silence with a funny face, for he had discovered that truth has its own music, far deeper than any Las Vegas orchestra could perform. The meaning of his journey was sealed in that instant of stillness, conveying a humanity that time would never be able to erase from the memory of those who witnessed the day the king of comedy decided to abdicate the throne in the name of the soul. The resolution was complete. The mask was left behind, and the man who walked out that service door was, for the first time in decades, someone truly free and at peace with his own shadow. Jerry Lewis taught us that a genius's greatest spectacle doesn't happen when he nails the timing of a joke, but when he has the courage to admit that the show cannot go on if the soul is absent. That night in Las Vegas was not the end of a career, but the birth of a truth that echoes to this day on the world stages, that comedy is a bridge, but humanity is the final destination. By choosing vulnerability over easy applause, he turned his sweat into dew and his pain into a beacon for all those who, hidden behind their own daily masks, beg to be seen beyond appearances. The image of the clown sitting on the edge of the stage, disarmed and real, remains as the definitive testament that true greatness lies in the ability to stop everything when the heart demands to be heard. The legacy of that discovery mid-show forces us to look at our own daily performances and question the price we pay to keep the world smiling while we crumble inside. If even the king of comedy needed to break protocol to save his own essence, what prevents us from being more honest with our own pains and discoveries? Jerry Lewis's story is a solemn reminder that laughter only has real value when it is the reflection of a life lived with integrity, and not a desperate escape from the reality surrounding us. If you were standing before thousands of people expecting a smile, would you have the courage to show your pain in the name of the truth? And in your opinion, what does this moment from Jerry Lewis reveal about the weight of wearing a mask to please others? Leave your comment